Before anyone in that quiet valley understood the significance of the trees she planted, before the helicopter thundered out of the sky, and before half a dozen officers snapped rigid salutes toward a woman they believed was an ordinary widow, there was a moment, a strange one, where the world seemed to hold its breath. If you've ever felt that the smallest actions can carry the weight of entire histories, then like and subscribe, because this story begins with a single handful of soil and the kind of silence that only arrives before secrets are revealed. Dawn had not yet broken when Elise Hart stepped into the cool hush of her backyard field, boots sinking slightly into dew-soaked earth, her breath a thin ghost of mist unraveling before her as she knelt to the ground. The world around her was still a shifting palette of half-light blues and muted grays, as though the sun wasn't entirely sure it wanted to rise today. Not here, not on this date, not on the day she both dreaded and honored with ritual precision. At 27, Elise had the posture of someone who had lived 3 lifetimes' worth of danger, yet somehow still walked as softly as a woman half her age. Her hands, steady and deliberate as she dug into the earth, belonged to someone who had spent thousands of hours gripping flight controls and storms of tracer fire. Yet they trembled faintly now, not from fear, but from memory. No one driving past the old county road would have guessed that the slight young woman in a charcoal hoodie, dark hair tied back, knees pressing into wet clay as she carved out a hollow for the first cedar sapling, had ever worn rank at all, much less the silver oak leaf of a major. Fewer still would imagine she was the same pilot whose call sign, whispered across briefing rooms and Sockamare hangars, carried a mythic weight. Halo, the one who flew into places, even other special operations. Crews whispered about only after a few drinks. They certainly wouldn't guess that the saplings she planted every year, 3 of them now standing beside her like young soldiers awaiting inspection, were her way of measuring time since her husband Daniel's death. His life marked not by dates on a headstone, but by the living things she coaxed from the ground in his honor. The field was quiet except for the occasional cry of an early bird and the distant hum of a power line catching the first faint sigh of wind. Elise pressed the soil around the base of the sapling, her fingers streaked with earth, her eyes focused in a way that suggested she was refusing to let her mind drift back to that night. The night she'd been grounded on emergency leave. The night she'd answered a knock at her door she still heard in her dreams. The night a pair of uniformed men told her. A mechanical failure, a fire, a spiral, a crash had stolen the life of the only person who made the world feel anchored. Somewhere deep in the pocket of her hoodie, a thin silver ring, his, pressed cold against her palm, and Elise closed her eyes for a long moment, leaning back on her heels as she whispered something so soft it was instantly swallowed by the waking landscape, a promise or a prayer, or perhaps just a name repeated into the soil. She thought she'd be alone this morning. She always was, because grief prefers solitude and ritual demands it, and Elise never expected the world to intrude on her quiet observance. She certainly didn't expect the strangeness that tingled through the air as she stood and moved to the second sapling. A subtle vibration at first, too faint to identify, too steady to ignore. It thrummed under her boots, through her calves, up her spine, a sensation so familiar that her eyes snapped open with the reflexive alertness of a pilot awakened mid-flight. She paused, soil crumbling from her fingertips, and the air shifted. The leaves in the surrounding trees fluttered though no breeze touched them. The ground shivered in gentle pulses, and Elise knew instantly, instinctively, the way only someone who had ridden rotors through hell knew, that this was no storm, no truck on the nearby road, no farm machinery on a neighbor's land. This was a helicopter coming in low, too close, not remotely on a civilian flight path. Not a coincidence. Elise's heartbeat didn't quicken. If anything, it slowed into that eerie, disciplined rhythm she slipped into during combat insertions, the part of her mind that had once navigated blackout emergency landings under fire taking immediate control. She rose fully now, squinting toward the horizon as a distant flicker of movement rippled through the gray morning haze, a dark shape emerging with the deliberate, predatory glide of a bird of prey. Her breath hitched, not in fear, but in recognition. She could tell by the sound long before she could see the silhouette that this was a specialized aircraft, the unmistakable signature thump of reinforced rotors cutting through dense early morning air like teeth. What the hell were they doing here? Elise wiped her palms on her hoodie automatically, though the gesture was more muscle memory than utility. 1,000 calculations fired through her mind. Altitude, speed, trajectory, the angle of approach, none of which made sense for a typical military route, and certainly not for this remote rural pocket, where she had sought anonymity after Daniel's death. When the aircraft finally broke through the haze with a low, sweeping descent, its matte black fuselage glinting faintly as the first shards of sunlight touched it, she felt the ground vibrate harder, dust and pine needles swirling in a widening circle around her. She stood between her 3 saplings like a small sentinel defending something sacred, eyes narrowed, jaw set, heart steady as the helicopter descended into her field, with a precision that suggested this was not a mistake, not a detour, but a mission. And as the skids touched the earth with a soft, final thud and silhouettes moved behind the tinted windows, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. This morning, this ritual, this quiet moment of remembrance she thought belonged solely to her husband, was about to become something else entirely. The helicopter's rotors were still groaning down when the side door slid open with a metallic thunk, releasing a burst of cold, recycled cabin air that mixed with the earthy scent of Elise's freshly turned soil. Out stepped a young officer, Captain Moreno, his uniform immaculate despite the rush of wind, his expression taut with that rigid, overconfident vigilance of someone who had memorized every regulation but lived none of the experiences behind them. His boots hit the ground with sharp military precision as he approached her, one hand resting near his belt in the universal gesture of someone prepared to enforce authority, whether or not it's actually needed. "Ma'am," he began crisply, scanning her up and down as though she were an unexpected variable in a controlled environment. "This area is restricted during active operations. I need to ask what you're doing near our landing zone." Elise didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't lift her voice above the same soft, steady cadence she used when talking men down from panic inside a shaking aircraft. "I'm planting trees," she answered, brushing a bit of soil from her knuckles while her gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking. Moreno, however, didn't seem to hear the simplicity of her response. He was too busy categorizing her. Young widow, civilian clothes, dirt under her nails, and drawing conclusions so far from the truth they might as well have been written in another language. "Restricted airspace protocols require identification," he said, stepping closer, his tone shifting from procedural to vaguely accusatory, as though merely standing on her own land at dawn had offended military order. Elise exhaled slowly, a practiced kind of patience threading through her, but before she could answer, the soldiers behind Moreno stiffened in sudden recognition, their eyes locked on a sliver of ink exposed on her wrist as her sleeve slipped. A small tattoo. 2 wings, a broken circle between them. The insignia only worn by the few who survived Nightfall Ridge. The sight hit them like a physical blow, their posture straightening with instinctive respect, but Moreno hadn't noticed. He was too absorbed in the authority he believed he wielded. Elise felt the shift though, the sudden ripple of quiet, the weight of eyes, and it told her everything she needed. The men who mattered understood exactly who she was, even if their captain did not. Moreno opened his mouth to speak again, but a voice thundered across the field before he formed a single syllable. "Captain, step back." The command cut through the morning air with such authority, it seemed to still even the rotor wash. The soldiers parted immediately, urgency in their movements, allowing Colonel Rourke to stride forward, a tall, broad-shouldered figure whose mere presence carried the gravity of someone who had made life-and-death decisions too many times to count. He stopped 3 feet in front of Elise, his weathered face shifting from hardened focus to something like stunned recognition. And then, without hesitation or ceremony, he snapped his heels together and delivered a salute so razor-sharp it seemed to slice the rising sunlight in two. "Major Hart," he said. "Major, not ma'am, not miss," his voice ringing with both reverence and relief. "Halo, it's an honor to see you." Captain Moreno froze, his spine stiffening, his sense of reality wobbling as if the ground beneath him had shifted. The woman he had nearly reprimanded, the woman with dirt under her fingernails and grief in her eyes, was the very pilot whose name carried a kind of mythic electricity across the special operations world. Elise returned a slow blink, but her voice remained calm, steady. "Colonel, you could have called." The corners of Rourke's mouth twitched in a fleeting, humorless almost smile. "We didn't call because this isn't routine, Major. We landed because the secretary insisted we retrieve you personally." He stepped aside slightly, allowing the rest of the team to form up behind him in perfect symmetry, a formation meant not for intimidation but for honor. "Your Distinguished Service Cross approval came through," he said, his tone softening with something unmistakably human. "Unanimous." Finally, Elise's breath caught, a barely perceptible tremor that vanished as quickly as it surfaced, not because of the award itself, but because of the timing, the place, the intrusion on the one morning she reserved for Daniel. Moreno's face drained of color, horror dawning on him as every soldier around him snapped to rigid attention and saluted the woman he had approached like a trespasser. Elise didn't gloat. Her expression remained unreadable, a quiet amalgam of pain, discipline, and something even deeper, resignation. She turned her gaze briefly toward the saplings behind her, their thin trunks trembling faintly in the rotor wind, as though acknowledging their place in this moment the way she acknowledged hers. She had wanted a morning of silence, of memory, of ritual. Instead, she got a landing zone and a formation of soldiers who now waited for her to speak, as though she were still in a cockpit, still giving orders in the thick of chaos. She looked back to Rourke, jaw set but eyes soft. "Then let me finish planting," she said quietly. "I owe him that." And without waiting for permission, because she didn't need any, she knelt once more in the earth, a major shaping the soil with bare hands while a dozen elite soldiers stood watch in silent, humbled reverence, aware they had stumbled into a sacred moment none of them fully understood. By the time Elise rose from the ground after pressing the final mound of soil around the base of the last cedar, the morning light had fully broken across the field, bathing everything. The saplings, the soldiers, the helicopter, even the tension, in a soft gold that made the scene feel surreal, almost suspended outside the normal flow of time. The men stood perfectly still as she wiped her hands on her hoodie, no one daring to interrupt the quiet gravity of her moment. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Colonel Rourke stepped forward again, his voice gentler now, stripped of the steel he'd used on his captain. "Major," he said, as though reintroducing himself to her place in the world, "there's more you need to know." Elise met his gaze, shoulders squared, posture instinctively sliding into the composure of an officer who once flew through gunfire and chaos with absolute clarity. "The secretary requested your presence immediately," Rourke continued. "Privately, he wants to present the Distinguished Service Cross in person, and he made it clear, extremely clear, that you deserve to hear what finally pushed the approval through." The soldiers behind him exchanged glances, but Elise didn't speak. She simply waited, still as a stone. Rourke exhaled. "Survivor accounts from Nightfall Ridge were reopened," he told her softly. "2 more members of the team you extracted came forward. They said they couldn't stay silent anymore." Elise's eyes flickered, just barely. Nightfall Ridge. The mission no one talked about. The mission she'd pulled 9 wounded Rangers out of, alone, in a helicopter that had been taking rounds like a tin can in a rock store. The mission where she'd made the impossible flight across mountain ridges with alarms screaming and hydraulics bleeding out. The mission where her co-pilot bled out beside her halfway home. And the mission where Daniel, her Daniel, should have been flying in her formation, but had been grounded for a mechanical inspection that saved him that night, only to lose him weeks later. Elise swallowed the memory like glass and nodded once for Rourke to continue. "They said," he went on quietly, "that you didn't just save their lives. You saved the entire operation. They said no one else could have flown that bird through that valley. Not with the damage you had. Not under that fire. Not in that storm." He paused, eyes shining with a respect deeper than rank. "They said you were the reason any of them came home." Elise didn't move, didn't blink. Her face held that same steady stillness she carried into danger, the same stillness she carried into grief. She had never wanted glory for Nightfall Ridge, only truth, and the truth had been buried in classified files and redacted reports for years. Rourke took a step back, signaling his men to form a protective corridor toward the helicopter. "We're here to escort you," he said, "whenever you're ready." The captain who had confronted Elise earlier stepped awkwardly aside as she walked past, his face drained, his arrogance dissolved into a raw mixture of shame and awe. Elise paused only long enough to look him in the eye, not with anger, but with something closer to a quiet, tired mercy. "See the person before you see the clothing," she said softly. "Assumption is a dangerous habit, Captain. For everyone." Moreno swallowed hard and nodded, the lesson etched into him with the permanence of a scar. Elise turned toward the helicopter, but not before glancing back at the three saplings standing silent and brave against the dawn breeze. They looked almost like a small honor guard of their own, slender and untested but rooted with promise. Daniel would have liked that. He would have said the earth remembers the hands that tend it. She drew a steady breath and climbed into the aircraft, settling into a seat that felt familiar and foreign all at once. A place where she had lived her fiercest victories and carried her deepest losses. As the doors slid shut and the rotors thundered to life, dust spiraled up around the cedars in a swirling halo, sending their young branches dancing in the wind like they were saluting her departure. The helicopter lifted, rising above her field, her home, her memories, and the horizon she once swore she would leave behind forever. But as the landscape unfolded beneath her, hills, trees, the winding road Daniel used to drive, something steadied in her chest. She wasn't just a widow kneeling in a field at dawn. She wasn't just a legend whispered about in briefing rooms. She wasn't just a pilot with a call sign born out of fire. She was Major Elise Halo Hart, a woman whose grief had not erased her purpose, whose roots ran as deep as the trees she planted, and whose flight, despite everything she'd lost, was far from over. The helicopter banked north, sunlight spilling across its hull, carrying her toward the recognition the world had finally decided she deserved, and toward whatever future waited for her beyond the edge of the horizon.